going to start. Thanks everybody for coming, for joining us for this session on storytelling and the media. I have with me today, by the way, my name is Leow. I'm the founder and organizer of Singapore Unbound, one of the two organizers of this media fair, together with Kirsten Han of Mekong Review. So I hope you've had a chance to walk around the fair on the 6th floor, right above this. If you did not, you're in for a treat after this event. We hope, of course, to finish around about 6. The fair will go on until about 6:30, so you will have a chance to go up to the fair and take a look at the various exhibitions. Over 20 independent media organizations and persons have tabled this afternoon, so you can find out a great deal about the independent media landscape in Singapore in one place on one day. But I'm so pleased to have with me today 3 really terrific storytellers. I'm going to introduce each one of them in turn, and they're going to read an excerpt of their work to you. In the case of Kelly, we're going to be playing 2 segments of a podcast that she co-wrote and co-produced. After each reading, I will pose them a question about the storytelling element of what they have read. And after the 3 readings, we will engage in a general discussion about storytelling and media. And during that time, I really want to invite everybody to ask questions as well. So get your questions ready for our very distinguished writers and storytellers this afternoon. So first up is Alfian. All right, no stranger to many of us, I'm sure. He is the resident playwright of Wild Rice. He's also a fiction writer and a poet. All right, so if you already know him as a dramatist, all right, you will want to get to know him today as a fiction writer as well. I believe Alfian is going to be reading for us a story from his story collection, Malay Sketches. Right, over to you, Alfian.
Thank you so much, G. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Wonderful crowd, capacity crowd. Okay, I'm going to read a little short story which is called The Hole, and this is from Malay Sketches, which is on sale upstairs. If anyone wants to get a copy of that, it's at the Ethos Books booth. Yeah, this is called The Hole. It was a little after I had my lunch when I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, a polite man greeted me and passed me an envelope. Please collect the body within 24 hours or it will be buried. There was no room for shock. The whole week I had prepared myself for this. I did not let my hands tremble as I accepted the envelope. I told myself I was receiving something that was weightless. The man left earlier than I expected. I did not like the idea that he felt it was only proper to leave me to grieve in private. He did not understand that there was no grief. My son and I had not spoken to each other for many years. Unlike his mother, I had refused to visit him in prison. I would have opened the envelope right in front of the man if he had stayed. I would have done it calmly, and when I'm done, I will look at him straight in the eyes and say, "Thank you." But the man would be mistaken if he had thought my actions were calm, because calmness meant that I was placing my feelings under control. But as I have said, I had no more feelings anymore. It was not calmness, but numbness. Very early on, I decided that everything that was happening was as a result of fate. It was fate that would hold my son up like a puppet from a rope, and it was also fate that would move my hands, also like a puppet, to tear the edge of an envelope. Inside the envelope was a letter. There was also my son's pink identity card. I put the letter to one side and stared hard at the IC. So this was what a dead man looked like. There were shadows under his eyes. There was something far away in his expression, a face not prepared for the snap of the camera. There was his name, my name also, separated from his by the word bin, his race, date of birth, country of birth, on the back his IC number, and our home address. But what absorbed me the most was a little hole that had been punched in his IC. It was there to say that the IC could no longer be used. To show someone an IC like this, you would have to place your finger and thumb over the hole, praying that nobody would notice that you're holding something that has been damaged. I suddenly saw my son holding the IC in this way, trying to pass himself off as someone who was still alive. It was just the sort of lying thing that I could expect from him. I imagined him doing it with that crooked smile on his face, the smile he always used to convince us that he would change, that he was listening, that everything would turn out all right. And I became angry. My anger turned towards the person who had punched the hole. I'd seen the way a credit card is destroyed with a big pair of scissors slicing it into two halves. Why couldn't they do the same with this IC? Why this clean, straightforward hole? I felt my anger burn first on my skin, through the flesh, like a droplet of acid right into my bones. My son was no more. I saw a series of circles, perfect circles, the outline of a playground, the stone table under our block, the noose tightening around his neck, the shape of his mouth when he was still a baby, shrinking to the size of the hole. It is an opening through which I feel my body leaking, drop by drop, until the day I join my son on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alfian. It's one of my favorite stories from the collection, Malay Sketches. Because, not because of the subject matter, of course, which is so sad, but because it's so beautifully written. I cannot imagine removing a single word from it. It is well constructed and well told about such a sad event. I wanted to ask you, since we're talking about storytelling, about your writing of this story, that, how did you decide to write this story from the point of view of the father, right? Because there are so many point of views here, right? It could be the person delivering the envelope, it could be the son, before the execution, and it could be the executioner. Did you try other points of view before you, land on this one?
My gosh, wow, that's a great question, G. I think one of the reasons why I wanted to try to imagine the father's point of view was I felt at that point in time when I was writing the story, it was going to be difficult to try to enter, let's say, the point of view of the person who was going to be executed, I think. Yeah. Of course, much later on, when I felt it was a bit more mature, I attempted that. But I think for me, so I have my own thoughts about the death penalty, right? But I did not want this story to be just a screed against the death penalty. It's not an abolitionist kind of manifesto. I think the power of stories is to allow you to enter another kind of consciousness. And I think the thing about having a character who's a father who one would expect to have this close relationship, who one would expect to feel the injustice of this law, I wanted to also find out what the nuances of that could be and certain kinds of ambiguities, right? So obviously the father has got a bad relationship with his son. And I think the father in the beginning was also trying to be the good citizen, so to speak, because he's looking, later on he sees the IC, he sees the bin, and if you're a Malay or Muslim person, bin is son off, right? So obviously you're implicated in the name of your own son, you feel that kind of responsibility. And I wanted to explore the consciousness of someone who feels implicated and then who has got to kind of perform a certain kind of, okay, no, I belong to the status quo. I think perhaps this law is good for the rest of Singapore. So I think that's why that whole kind of mental journey about I want to present this kind of like stoical front to the person delivering the letter. But I think at the same time also, as much as he believes, let's say, in upholding these laws, I also think the idea that the son has to die is also really unacceptable for him, right? So I think it's a kind of journey that's happened within this story where someone feels, okay, I'm a good Singaporean, I don't know how my son turned out this way, etc. And maybe I need to kind of like distance myself from this bad egg that somehow ended up my family. But I think through that also you realize, oh, but maybe there are limits to punishment. You know, maybe, and that limit is of course murder, right? State sanctioned murder. Yeah.
No, that's really great. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? Because there is an internal journey that the father undergoes. But the story is so short. So it's a long journey in a very, very short story, right, in some ways, right? And you mentioned about, the desire to explore the nuance in this father's experience too, right?
Yeah.
So what are some of the kind of, actual details you include that you added to the story to, give us this flesh and blood feel of the nuance? It's not just in the head, but something very visceral, isn't it? I mean, one of the details, of course, you mentioned is, the name of the son and the father on the IC.
Yeah.
Were there other details you were very consciously also adding to help us to understand the journey that the father is undergoing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I do think the image of the son, so when he says this is what a dead person look like, right? So also kind of that language where, you just say dead person rather than son. The idea that this is a kind of like a posthumous kind of image, yeah, of the son, even though it was taken when the son was still alive, yeah, definitely. And also like maybe certain words. So when he says that the son was not ready for the snap of the camera, so why did I choose the word snap, for example? Because for me, it's an echo of what happens when you get hung by the long drop technique, right? So your I mean, it's really gory, but your cervix gets snapped in that process, and that's supposed to lead to instantaneous death. Yeah, and of course, I think looking at images as well. So when I was talking about the whole and all all these images that the whole kind of rhymed with, and going back to memory, so going from something really specific, which is the noose, which we think, oh, this is something that happens to bad people, people who's had the death penalty, but kind of like linking it to all these other images, like the stone table under the block, about the shape of the mouth, the baby's mouth, and I think that's one way in which I try to expand this kind of empathy that you might have for this person, because obviously we've seen that stone table, obviously we know what the baby's shape of the mouth is, and obviously this person who's died was also a child once, right? So the idea of the child that's just innocent and then becomes an adult, and all these things happen to his life.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a familiarity of those images, right?
I also want to add maybe something that where I feel that the father's journey, so it's not just trying to empathize with the father, but I also do feel it reflected, let's say, my own journey in thinking through the death penalty, where in the beginning, you're kind of convinced by the argument that it is a deterrent. And I do know that when people conduct these surveys about the death penalty, the way it's worded, right, often it's kind of like weighted towards people, oh yeah, if we don't have the death penalty, then drugs are going to flood Singapore streets, as if people who take drugs don't have that kind of agency, right? As if like, if you see it, you'll completely just take it, right? So that kind of journey where I've also learned that when survey questions focus, let's say, on questions of like, okay, do you think that death penalty is justified in the event that, let's say, that there could have been an error made, for example, if the evidence is questionable, those kinds of things. So if people start zooming in, and start thinking about people, about human beings rather than just the law.
Yeah.
So I think that's really the value of the story. Actually, you humanize. Right?
Yeah. No, that's so interesting. I love it when you actually, teaching me new things about this story because, you said that, the journey of the father kind of reflected your own journey, right? As a citizen, right? Your own changing attitudes towards the death penalty. And so really as the reader, because of the use of the I, I'm also placed in the father's position. And hopefully, of course, the reader undergoes, right, that same journey too. Right. Thank you very much, Alfian. I'm going to come back with more general questions for you after the readings. But we want to actually also hear from Kelly Leow. Kelly is the co-writer and the co-producer of Aware's Saga podcast, and I believe you right now works as the communications manager for Aware too.
Yes, for 1 more month.
Where are you going on to next?
I'm going to do a master's.
Yeah. I see. Great. Would you like to say something about the 2 segments from the podcast that you've chosen to play for us?
Yeah, and I feel like it's very hard to go after that. That was like a really devastating story, and I'm very sad right now. But and this is not gonna be very devastating, hopefully. But so I chose 2 clips from the episode number 8. It's called Feminist Mentor. I'm kind of counting on most people in this room having listened. I'm really sorry if you haven't, because the whole experience is going to be ruined for you by this. But so leading up to this episode kind of takes place like a month after the sort of hostile takeover of Aware in March 2009. So this is like late April 2009. And the takeover faction has been dubbed the New Guard. So if you hear like the New Guard, that's like who these women are. It's a group of women who the press has kind of uncovered. They all go to the same church. But up until then, they have sort of resisted all the media's attempts to kind of, and I think both media and also like private attempts to kind of find out like, why did you do this? Who are you? Like, what is your actual motivation? So then 1 month into this whole saga, they did this. They held this bombshell sort of press conference where they explained in more detail who they are, what they actually are seeking in taking over Aware, and sort of, I guess, a secret, what's the word? Secret feminist mentor that had been sort of pulling the strings behind the scenes that they had, up until then, had not revealed. Yeah, I think that's enough of context.
Yeah, shall we play?
Yeah, so that there's 2 clips. Yeah, we can play both in a row.
Okay, one after another. Right, let's hear the first clip followed by the second.
The journalists. The New Guard smile nervously. This is not how they meant to begin their very first press conference. They've been waiting for this moment. Because today, almost a month after the AGM, the New Guard will finally explain why they had to take over Aware. And along the way, reveal some shocking secrets about one of Singapore's premier civil society organizations.
This Aware wasn't just any organization. In the 25 years that it had been in existence, it was in the news a lot.
Can I ask you a very direct question? This was not a well-organized, well-thought-through constitutional coup.
No, not that I know of. I think over until they started working on the...
There's no proper education in schools to deal with sex education. So all these things are a terrible legacy of Section 377A.
The first thing they asked for was the syllabus. Now, what is it, the slides that we present at the schools we talk to the kids?
And that's kind of my first realization that the ends justify the means.
I'm Baraki Jagdish. This is Saga, Episode 8, Feminist Mentor.
Friends of the media, thank you for coming at such late last-minute notice.
That's Josie Leow, the New Guard's Aware president. She looks grim in a dark grey shirt. She speaks emphatically into her mic, swallowing hard between sentences.
I had said in my first and last interview after being appointed as president of Aware that I did not get involved in Aware to be engaged in controversies. And so far I've kept a very stoic and dignified silence. But with the recent happenings of events, I have no choice, it left me no choice to break this silence and come up publicly to say what's been happening.
Josie, Jenica, Lois, and Maureen begin by describing the regrettable way they have been treated since coming into office at Aware. This includes online harassment from anonymous trolls, the Aware Center staff being uncooperative, and the media portraying them as hijackers.
To date, I have only been met with hostility, intimidation. I felt so bullied, I tell you. I will tell you what's happening. My family received death threats, and it's now a police case. Each day I fear for the physical safety of my children, my family.
The women are hurt, confused. They never asked for this.
All I wanted to do is to serve the community and be a member of this Aware, to push for the cause of women. Do I deserve this? Death threat? What has Singapore become? Is this what we want in Singapore?
Then the EXCO members turn to the fifth person at the table with them, a bespectacled older lady. She has been quiet all this while, letting the others say their piece.
Now you're wondering why Dr. Theo Sumian is here today? I think I will leave it to her to tell you her perspective of what's going on with Aware.
At last, it's her cue to take the stage.
Good evening. I'm here as feminist mentor.
The woman behind the curtain, Dr. Theo Sumian.
Okay, that's the first clip. And then, so imagine some time passes in the press conference. And then so this next clip is like sort of later on in the press conference when they're like kind of explaining their motivations.
To advance artificial insemination, which for some reason she objects to. Theo's next point is a big one.
To my horror, I found that you want to introduce men into a woman's society.
Gays, says Dr. Theo, are slowly but surely filtering into Aware's membership. They plan to take over via the proposed constitutional amendments concerning associate members' rights to vote.
It is proposed to give men the vote. It is also proposed to give disputed women the vote. And what is very bizarre, you want to give teenagers the vote. Are the men masquerading as the homosexual activist men coming under the umbrella of Aware? So if you look at some of their materials, the language now is always men and women, men and women. Now, if it's in your objectives, when it is lesbianism that you want to encourage, then you form your separate company, separate organization. And if the men want to push the homosexual agenda, they can form their own organization. But leave the women.
Okay, a bit of context here. Whether men and non-Singaporeans should be allowed to vote on Aware matters was a long-standing question, though not for the reasons that Dr. Theo imagines. On the one hand, many Aware members saw the organization as a space in which Singaporean women could be free of the patriarchal oppression they suffered in other realms of life. A chance to right the scales in a small way. On the other hand, some argue that gender equality has as much to do with men as women, and Aware had lots to gain by engaging the male population. Regardless of where you stood on that debate, Theo's idea that Aware's male associate members were masquerading as feminists for some ulterior homosexual motive was hard to swallow. Now, having laid out all her proof, Theo concludes her argument.
So I believe that Aware should be brought back to its original focus, which is, I'm sure, set up by my friends, that it will go back to look after the majority, all women of Singapore to advance in cause.
At this point, the members of the new EXCO begin to chime in. Jenica points to a presentation screen which lists more clues to the supposed gay conspiracy at Aware. For one, she says, a gay man named Alex Au
was famous homosexual activist.
Spoke on a 2005 Aware panel about the rise of HIV cases in Singapore. This is true. Alex was a panelist alongside a doctor, an AIDS activist, and then Aware president Brahma Mavi. Then the next year, Aware held a Mother's Day event.
Inviting lesbian-friendly mothers and lesbian daughters to talk about their experience.
Josie speaks up now. She references something she had said on the show, Talking Point.
Again, at my last interview, I said aware has lost focus. But I think I was being very polite when I said that. It has really not lost its focus, but I think it's gone further than that, much, much further than that. It has now become a single objective organization.
Finally, Maureen explains the new guard's interest in Aware's CEDAW Shadow Report. This report, you'll remember, is to be submitted to the United Nations. If, Maureen speculates, the Shadow Report has been assembled in part by gay activists, it will present a skewed, gay-positive version of Singapore to the UN, and that would be an embarrassing misrepresentation on an international stage.
And next time you didn't form your separate organization, we would have been happy to leave Aware to do the work which it was supposed to do. Our concern is that Aware appears to be being hijacked to another direction, which is not the direction we believe is the original objective, the original noble objective of Aware.
Listening to their presentation here, it's hard to get a full view of the picture the new guard is painting. So, to summarize, they believe that Aware, Singapore's most recognized feminist organization, has quietly given up the work of fighting for women's rights. They say it has begun advocating for the rights of gay men and foreign women, presumably lesbians. The new guard thinks once the gays get full membership, that faction will gain control of Aware. They'll use the organization's events and its sex education program to spread homosexuality like a virus across Singapore. The result, an entire generation of lesbians and gays. Great conspiracy theories. This one has an apocalyptic tinge. It's grandiose, dramatic, Byzantine in its logic. And of course, it has zero basis in reality.
Yeah, no, it sounds a lot shorter when you're brushing your teeth and like it's playing in the background. It face with a lot of people all like staring like at the.
Yeah, Kelly, I thought that those two clips were great clips to actually play, at this panel about storytelling and media. Because, it has such a clear antagonist, right? The feminist mentor with the supporting cast of characters, the new guard, all speaking up in their various ways, right? And then it has this big reveal. This is who she is, this climax, when we hear their real arguments, their real motivations. And then so interestingly, at the end of the second clip, the narrator summarized their story. They think that Aware has been hijacked by gay men for their own purposes, right? So they had a story in their mind, right? Guiding them and motivating their action, right? Yet, of course, by the sound of it, because, there were other clips that showed that the journalists at this press conference were really kind of confused by what they were saying. So I could imagine that actually the press conference itself would have been pretty chaotic and pretty confusing. So how did you and your co-writer go about ordering what happened at this, press conference into such a dramatic story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you asked me to pick out a clip that sort of illustrated some of the challenges, right, in writing Saga. So I think this was definitely one of the hardest, if not the hardest episode to write from my side. And also, I wanted to show it because I think honestly this press conference was what made me think that this should be a podcast in the first place, right? So a bit of I guess backstory is that in 2018 I was a freelance editor and writer, and I had met some of the Aware people, and they had mentioned to me, oh, we're thinking of next year is the 10th anniversary of the saga, and we're thinking of doing some kind of commemorative project, like a book or maybe a website, right? And I was like, oh yeah, I would love to be involved. This was such a, I have such strong memories of this myself, right, from when I was 18 when it happened. And then, so I was like, yeah, I'll go back and kind of do a bit of research. And I want to shout out Roy Tan, right, for maintaining the Singapore LGBT Encyclopedia, which is a super super comprehensive sort of wiki website. So I went and I was just kind of reading everything that he had on the Aware Saga page, right? And I found that he had actually cataloged all the all the media, like so like the press conferences, right, and other sort of like available things on YouTube. So I just sat down and I watched the press conference, and it's like a 75-minute thing, and my jaw was just like on the floor by the end of it. I was like, it felt like, and I highly recommend if anyone is interested to go home and watch the full 75 minutes, because it actually plays like a feature film. Like it is so riveting. And I mean, so in many ways, right, I was like this, like, you know that feeling where like, wow, I just wanted to tell everybody the story. And like, I feel like that's how you know that you're sitting on like a gold mine of the story, when you're just like dying to tell everybody, and you're like, everybody must know. And there are many ways in which, like, I think a book, right, or a website or something more, I guess, static, right, for lack of a better word, would not have done justice, right, to that press conference. Because, I mean, I think like sort of the inherent drama, like the richness of like what happens in the press conference, which is like they come in and they're like, we have this smoking gun. And then it ends up being like the most sort of like banal, benign like NGO work of like, oh, they had a panel about AIDS, and they were teaching kids about sex education. So like that, I think there's a lot of inherent humor in that, but also I think there's a lot of humor in, I mean, not just humor, right? There's a lot of pathos. Like I also want to point out that, like, you know, I think that they are truly aggrieved, right? I mean, they're talking about the harassment that they face, the death threats. And I think just the listening to like the tenor of their voices, right? That was something that I was like, we can't sacrifice that by putting it into like, putting it on the page. And I mean, even just like the accents, like the sort of range of accents that are at play in that press conference, I think tells a whole little story on its own. And I was like, you know, this, like, we can't, it's too rich of a text. In terms of how to organize it, right? Because yeah, like I said, 75-minute press conference. If I had my way, we could have put the whole thing in, but we did feel very constrained about how long the episodes had to be, and this is like one of the longest episodes. It's like 54 minutes or something like that, which for us is already quite pushing it, because a lot of people had told us, right, like no one's gonna listen to like long episodes. You gotta keep episodes as short as possible. 20 minutes is good. I don't think we ever were able to keep the 20 minutes. But so there is a need, right, to sort of like distill and summarize. So I think like, yeah, sort of balancing three objectives, I would say. So one is like, yeah, a dramatic, engaging sort of narrative structure, right, to this episode. And it's difficult because it was such a Byzantine, like we wrote, Byzantine complex narrative that they were presenting, that like to even make sense of it, I was like, oh, look, you know, how to explain this, like what they're saying, it's so hard to even like sort of pass it yourself as a listener. So that's one. And the second one is, I think, to present their narrative fairly, right, and accurately. I think that was really important because even though we tried, and I wrote a lot of painstaking emails, they did not want to be part of the project. And so, you know, them not being there to share their side of the story, I think it was really important that we were not seen to be misrepresenting or over-editorializing what they were saying, right? And obviously, because of time, like, we had to summarize. But I would like to have, you know, the more summarizing, the more danger I think there is of us trying to make it sound like, you know, putting words into their mouths, right, that they didn't put. So we really tried to sort of like retain as much of their own the actual raw sort of footage, right, without too much editing. And then lastly, I think the need to debunk like what they're saying, right, because on the one hand, yeah, I want to represent what their narrative was, but on the other hand, their narrative is so false. Right, it is so like inherently false, and I think it would have been irresponsible for us to kind of let that narrative sit out all in its entirety without us kind of doing what we did structurally, which is to kind of come in after every point and be like, that's not true, and then like next point, that's also not true, like, you know, because and I wish we wouldn't. We did think about maybe not doing that, but maybe just running the whole thing at first and then coming back and being like, remember this point? That's not true, like, you know, but that would have. I think because of how widespread the attitudes that they have are in Singapore, all the more we had this responsibility to be really, really critical, right? We can't uncritically present these. This is one of the episodes I think that has more value judgment from the narration than maybe some of the others, but I hope that you felt that it was still fairly neutral, right? In terms of like, we're describing what's going on. There is a little bit of opinionating at the end. It's grandiose, it's Byzantine, right? There's zero like truth to it. Like, okay, but I have to, right? Like, have to. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think many of us in the room, if not all of us, agree with you. You know, definitely critical commentary was called for. But I was also very struck when I listened to these clips again. You know that you presented their grief as well, because these women really, this young women, they were quite young then, right? In their 30s, maybe. Some, okay.
No.
So these women, I mean, because I'm thinking of a feminist mentor who is much older, right?
Yeah.
So they're younger in comparison to her. That these women really did not know what they were getting into, right? And then it hit them, and it hit them really hard. You know, so the podcast made me feel a little bit of sympathy for them, even though they're so misdirected, right? Thank you so much for that. Did we give Kelly a round of applause? Thank you. And we have a third reader for you. Before we actually ask our three speakers more general questions about the relationship between media and storytelling. Our third reader is Victor Fernando R. Ocampo, who is a speculative fiction writer and also a data engineer. No, a technology person. What do you do in technology? Sorry. That shows you how much I know about technology.
I work with AI and W3 technologies primarily. Yes, it does work with data, but not necessarily so. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
AI. Sorry. Please go ahead and.
Yeah. So.
Victor is going to be reading from his story from the book The Infinite Library and Other Stories.
This one, yeah, which is available upstairs. So, so the interesting thing here is that when you write in a mode of fiction, whatever it is, even if it's realist fiction, you're actually making a value judgment all the time. Even if you're actually making fanfic, you're writing, you're never free of the author's point of view. That is the sad reality here. So you have to forgive my point of view here. When I was writing this, this is the longest. This story had the longest gestation of everything that I've ever written, and the root of this is actually way back in 2013. The Singapore government released a population white paper that I'm sure many of you know was very controversial. It also, that was the start of an unfortunate period of a lot of xenophobia in Singapore at that period. And this story was actually a product of that. And it's funny that Alfian actually began this story about the death penalty because, see, privilege is a strange thing. It goes on a sliding scale here. And in this short story, which is too long to read the whole thing, what happens when Singapore is rich enough that you don't even have to die if you have the death penalty? What happens is you get immigrants who are from poor countries who want to be here. Yeah, well, they become that person. So in the Romans, they had this thing called the 1 in 10, which is the title of the story. If you get in the case of an army rebellion or something like that, or a failure, the people who are guilty, they can choose one person, usually one of 10 people that's there, and that person becomes essentially the whipping boy of that. He takes the sins of all the other people that are there. So they execute that person. Whether that person is guilty or not is beside the point. So what happens in a society where you get rich enough that if you committed a crime and you're a valuable member of society, you can actually buy your way. You can sponsor an immigrant here, and they will, if he's not called for his national service, it's fine, he gets to live. But if he is, then too bad. That's what you signed up for, and this is what the story is. Yeah, so the interesting thing about this story is if you actually read it, it's written in leet speak and SMS talk. That's because I was thinking, having lived in 6 countries and being a foreigner for most of my life, one of the things I want to share with people is that weird thing of not being able to exactly understand everyone that is around you. If you go to another country where you don't speak the language, or even if you speak a little bit, there's always that part of you that's wondering what people are talking about, or what are they talking about you, or something like that. So Shakespeare said that the undiscovered country is death, but actually for everybody who goes to a place that doesn't understand them, it's always an undiscovered country. And I wanted to give that same sense to people who read this story. So it is called I Am the One in 10, and I'm going to skip the Latin. Okay, no, maybe I should say it. By the way, I have never ever read this story out before, and if I trip up because of my own writing, I deeply apologize.
I wish we could actually show you the script itself because it's really quite special.
Yeah.
So, for example, I am the 1 in 10.
It's literally I am the 1 in 10.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
M is just M. You know, the is D, and so forth. Yeah.
So it's so funny that I'm reading this one story where I'm afraid that I'm going to trip up to a room full of media people. Neceporo quisquam est qui dolorem ipsum qui dolor sit amet consecutor adispsi velit. Neither is there anyone who loves pain itself, since it's painful, and thus no one wants it. Cicero on the purpose of good and evil. They are coming for me, my dev-null executioners. I got no time left. So you, dear reader, have to fill in the gaps in my story. I don't know who you are, but if you value your life, listen to me. I am a dead man talking. Listen carefully. So life hack number 10, speak their Latin or die. I signed up because I want only the best for my family. That's the only safe answer if anyone asks you why you're here. Be very careful what you say, and remember, always remember, see, here it is again. Sorry, actually, I think I better pick up my glasses because I'm farsighted. Yeah. Give me 1 second. Oh, sorry. Thank you, G. Yeah. Okay. Optimum net pati quid emendem nor passis. It's better to endure what you can't change. Your fucking life depends on it. Yeah. And don't even speak your mind. If you're a resident in the new cities, your mind's not yours, not anymore. So speak their Latin or die. If they pursue conversation, stick to trivial topics. Rhetorical questions can and will give you away. You never know who you'll be talking to. Okay, sorry. Sorry, bad vision. And it's worse. It's even better with it, even with the far side. Yeah. Okay, this is a disaster. I'm so sorry. Yeah. If they pursue conversation, stick to trivial topics. Rhetorical questions can and will give you away. You never know who you'll be talking to. Let suspicion breed your confidence. In the new cities, the walls have eyes and every word is twittered by the wind. Speak only everyone's truth. Think before you speak, and never ever post what you really feel. Hide yourself fierce, hide yourself deep. Here's a good innocuous subject to talk about. The new cities are the cleanest, safest, and most modern places to live on the planet. Tell them that you're extremely grateful, no, privileged to be so far away from the famine and filth of the rest of the world. That isn't a lie, you know. For all intents and purposes, you'll be living in a virtual hotel, a fancy country club. Each and every one of those new cities is a high-tech dream built on the back of the world's greed, pasteurized and homogenized by 1,000 years of steady business. It's a society decorated by the rape of so many old countries, a Frankenstein's monster built from actual authentic cultures that they just couldn't fake. Each and every one of the new cities is also a prison, one whose bars are determined by your income and your IQ levels. Tell them something about how your kids will go to the top schools in the world. You have to paint your spawn in the ambitious sort, or they'll be cast aside in their streaming process. Remember that they view your children as contributions to the 5 futures: fecundity of family, felicity in society, freedom from fear, focus in industry, and forever prosperity. If you're lucky, your kids will become citizens, not a bottom-feeding drone like me. And if you're really lucky, one or more of them will be born with extraordinary genes. You'd have hit the jackpot of genetic destiny, the building of perfect little beasts, beauty plus brains. But at least your children won't have to join you. They will never become the 1 in 10. Life hack number 9. Love is a group thing. I know we've never met, but if you're part of the 1 in 10, I know that you wouldn't have made it this far without an approved Latin-speaking wife and at least 2 kids. You wouldn't even be reading this if you weren't born just like me. We weren't children of the obscenely wealthy, one who could buy their way in with dollars. We're the sons and daughters of a middle-class family whose dreams reached far beyond their grasp of reality. Like you, I was mommy and daddy's perfect little hijo. I was valedictorian all the way from kindergarten to my university days. I slacked off a bit in law school, where to the utter disappointment of my parents, I fell in love with another boy. But no, it wasn't really his penis that bothered them. There were medicines to correct that minor inconvenience. His family wasn't even really poor. Truth to tell, they were just as upper middle class as mine. The real problem was that his parents didn't have the same political leanings. My boyfriend and his family shunned the new cities. And not wanting to live in the new cities was perhaps the worst social sin imaginable. You'd be left socially castrated, and losing your social cojones was much, much worse than losing the real thing. My lover's father was an old-fashioned journalist who blogged about how authentically fake the new cities were. But how the shallow promise of wealth and prosperity was really nothing but a bit bucket for the soul. His mother was a rabble-rouser who encouraged workers to reap the benefits of their work instead of expecting them to live in cheap, gated high-tech communities. My mother couldn't understand my attraction. They're so proudly proletarian, she stuffed. Every time I see them, I have to roll my eyes. Look how fat his parents are. Only poor people are fat these days. Ew, think about it. At least they're not starving. No one is hungry anymore. Everyone who wants to be beautiful is beautiful. There's no need for revolution. But you don't really know them. They're not poor, I protested. Please just meet them once, I beg. I love him. Ay nako. Hijo, being poor is not about money. It's a state of mind. They're just so déclassé. Understand me. You never just love a person. You don't get hitched to just one person, she said. Relationships are always a group thing. People come with family, friends, etc., etc. These others, they're not always the best sort. So choose your love wisely. So I can't love anyone I want, I objected. Is that what I want? Is what I love important at all? My mother didn't understand my question. Well, I love you, and there's no space in my life for anyone else, she said. Success depends on loving the right person and hating the right people. Yeah. Choose who you love wisely. Your life depends on it. And certainly your inheritance does. My mother was not one to threaten lightly. So life hack number 8. A good brain is incompatible with a good heart. What is the square root of existence? If you're lucky, if you're one of the lucky ones, you have no fear of material discomfort. But not me. It was not enough just to be alive. I had to live. Okay. Sorry, I can't show you what emoticons look like on the page. Yeah. I remember my fragile soul being scared all of a sudden, scared and uncertain about what to do. Then on my way home, I saw a stooped old man push an ice cream cart in front of me. He struggled uphill, pushing a cart of 5,000 flavored Dodo Pops, which the uncallous caring world passed him by, fucking dead as a Dodo Pops. That was my future right there. And a light bulb turned on in my head, my own dark epiphany. What I would really wanted in life for myself, for my own happiness, was not gradus annus rodentum. Actually, what I wanted for myself was not worth a rat's ass. What I wanted was what everybody else wanted. And that's essentially it. I don't want to be poor. I decided then, right there and there, I needed to take my parents happy, to apply myself and make something of my future. Never decide for yourself, my mother always said. The wisdom of the crowds is infallible. I pulled out my phone and set up a poll on my profile page. Yes, I appeared to be selfish and finally let the word decide for me. All it took was a dodo pop. The feeling was heady and liberating, like your first orgasm. Hello world, what should I do with my life? Go to postgraduate school? 1A, 2, trade up the Volun chain, or D, nothing. My survey said that I should dump my boyfriend, which I did that evening. He tried in vain to tell me how much he loved me, but somehow that wasn't as worth to me as much anymore as my inheritance. I needed to prove to myself that I could be like everyone else. I quit cold turkey. Still, my ex didn't understand what happened. He made a very public, very noob threat to take his life. Unfortunately for him, I was already plugged into my new social world. All I wanted to do was now be part of the swarm. I told him that he was yesterday's news, and I couldn't downgrade to my previous version. I left him crying by the side of the street. Once safely home, I tweeted him again to remind him that our little chapter was over. Actually, this is pretty long, so I'm not sure where to end it. The problem is it gets morally more reprehensible. And he essentially sacrifices himself, his sexuality, everything, just so he can conform and live in this society where everything is perfect. And the killer of this is that that's what he chose at the end. He's actually that person that together to get into this society, he becomes that expendable 1 in 10 person. And what happens when other people also know that is the interesting part of the story, which I will let you read. But let me read just a little bit more. Yeah. I removed all my posts about him. I even took down the sex tape that we've been so proud of. It was now my time to move on. Thick face equals thick face, check. Black heart, on. A few months later, I heard that something terrible had happened to him. One of my friends had posted it so gruesomely on his status update. I guess even back then I felt a little guilty for his tragedy, at least on some level. Maybe I shouldn't have dated so soon after we broke up, but what could I do? My mother had set me up with the son of her amiga. We all make our choices in life. He made his choice when he jumped over that building. I made mine when I unfriended his memorial page. I couldn't bear to attend his funeral. Such is life. Lovers come and go, but mommy will always love you, my mother concluded. Then she took me shopping. My indiscretion was quickly hushed up. However, despite my parents' best efforts, social media was a difficult animal to control. My ex's parents saw to that. They flooded the blogs, the forums, and every online media outlet possible with stories about how their son had been so lucky to have been with someone who supported leftist liberal ideas, someone who could think for himself and choose what's right. They posted and promoted every picture and every video where I lambasted the new cities and made fun of my parents' social climbing. My parents, my friends, and my school were all mortified. My poor judgment and for my poor judgment and conduct unbecoming, I was duly punished. Socially excluded by everyone, online and off. My wide circle of schadenfreunds and frenemies all abandoned me. Everyone was still horribly polite, but no one sat to me in the cafeteria. No one commented on my posts anymore. No one sent me any text. No one wanted to have sex with me. And no matter how much I sexted, I was a social leper. My university debated for a long time on what to do about my case. Eventually, they let me graduate. I was the best in my class, and I always had perfect grades, but I was in the oldest and most prestigious feeder school for the new cities. I should have been a valedictorian, but as it was, I was lucky to have been given cum laude at all, or maybe it wasn't luck. But the new auditorium that my parents funded, well, that's another story. I didn't care anymore. I was already starting to feel dead inside. Okay, so I know it's hard to feel sorry for a fucking cum laude, believe me, I know. But the reality was, to be selected to be in the new cities, you had to have the best paper qualifications. My mother, dearest, the broken-hearted parent that she was, said that cum laude was just not good enough. I remember her crumpling my award and throwing it in the waste bin. Since then, I've always associated the noise of crushing paper with the sound of defeat. It made me feel like the proverbial person who lost 100 kilos but still felt fat. It has been my pet paranoia ever since. So I'll leave with that. And let you go from that.
Thank you very much, Victor. It's really, really not easy to read because of the text, but you did a good job of it, I think. So, you know, the new cities are where everybody in this place wants to actually get to, isn't it? And in the new cities, the lingua franca, you know, the language in common use is Latin, right? And you explained that it is for the purpose of political control. So I was very intrigued by that. Could you say a little bit more about why a dead language, right, which is prized, you know, for its formal and aesthetic qualities, right, may be used as an instrument of political control?
A historian who I used to like, Yuval Noah Harari, said that stories are the most powerful weapon that people have. It is when we have stories that we can move huge masses of people to do one thing, and just one thing. And the way that we do that is actually through language, but actually it's more than just language. We move people because of stories. And because of that, you use words in order to tell stories. And so words is our way of sharing an experience with people and also telling them stuff to do. So they're in a way a form of control over people. By controlling the language and keeping it from growing, you keep it pure ideologically. So for the longest time, for example, the Catholic Church said the Mass in Latin, and it wouldn't have it translated in the vernacular purely for that reason. Actually, for almost 1,500 years, it was all in Latin because it was a pure language, it was dead. It cannot change. Now that is actually physically impossible to do. And even in the Catholic Church itself, they found that the Latin was changing because, you know, we're not dead. Maybe if zombies pick up Latin or some language, then you can have literally a dead language. But as long as you are alive and your circumstances change, there is no way you can keep a language dead. Yeah, so yes, it's a futile effort in here, but then again, okay, I have to add, I'm not against the law or anything here. The law is an ideal people speak to, and in this case, trying to do that means they wanted to keep the purity of it. Okay, from some perspective, that is also correct, and some people value that. But the law is actually an ideal, in the sense that you need to be your perfect self in order to do it. If you're not your perfect self and your law is wrong, and it's not just, you have to fight it, and that is your job, being a person under the law. And so, and this is the same thing with language. And the reason they tried to do that was because it's something that they felt was important, just like your aware saga thing. For them it was important. It could be horribly wrong, but to them it was important. And they just needed a way to control it.
Thank you very much. Those are really, really interesting ideas. I'm trying to like wrap my head around them now, isn't it? So you're saying that, you know, the dead language can be used as a means of control because of its purity, right? And it's pure because it does not change. And because it does not change, therefore, of course, you know, the government can actually use it to mean whatever they want to mean, and nobody will be able to challenge that in that sense, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And then we also made a further point, you know, an analogy. You make an analogy, comparison, right, between the law and language. That both can actually be ideals, but at the same time, they can also be used to oppress.
Yes.
And when they do, then of course, you know, men and women and non-binary persons may actually, in their historical circumstances and in historical actions, actually challenge what is seen as ideal, but perhaps rather abstract. So yeah, I'm just trying to like, understand those things too. So if you have more questions about, you know, language and the use of language for both its ability to control, but also for its ability to liberate, all right, please ask Victor those questions. But I do want to turn to all three of our panelists now and get, you know, the conversation in this whole room going. Please get ready your questions for them. By just, you know, again, drawing our attention back to the topic of this panel, right? Which is, you know, storytelling and media. Because I think some writers, you know, have been known to draw a very firm line between art and journalism, right? So for them, art is something that's timeless, transcendent, pristine, pure again, and non-political, right? Whereas journalism is seen by them as time-bound, context-dependent, muckraking, and political. So when you were writing, you know, Malay sketches, Alfian, and when you're writing Saga, you know, Kelly, and when you're writing Infinite Library, Victor, I know this was some time ago when you were writing what you wrote. Were you influenced by the news around you then, as you were writing your work? If you were, how were you influenced by the news you were actually hearing or reading or listening to? Can you give us an example of that? And did you change anything in the writing because of the news?
Okay. We're following that same order. Is it?
Anyone.
Okay.
Whoever wants the mic.
Right. So I think as a writer, definitely one of the things that kind of like inspires or maybe influences my own writing is the news. So there are, especially I think if you live in a kind of authoritarian country where there's really not much media freedom, I think there's always that itch to unpack what's behind the headline and what's behind the news article. So I think when I was writing Malay sketches, so I think Shimamanda Adichie, right? So she's written about the single story, right? And I do feel that sometimes when you are writing in a kind of like restricted sphere, and she talks about the danger of the single story, not that it's untrue, but it's incomplete, right? And that's where stereotypes are generated. So I've always been fascinated by what's between the lines in, let's say, a Straight Sons article. You know, what is being omitted, what's being left out of the frame because of a certain kind of angle so I've always felt that as a writer in this country, it's my duty to write in those blanks. So definitely when I was writing Malay sketches, I was very struck by, let's say, certain headlines or statistics, etc., that would often portray, let's say, members of the Malay community in certain ways that are a bit either pathologized or criminalized. For example, a lot of reference to, let's say, drugs or divorce or incarceration, all these things, and I think, and it's interesting, right? Because on one hand, all these media stories and all that are supposedly based on fact and truth, and shouldn't the counter be through other facts, right? But I felt that fiction allowed me another space to counter these stories, because I think one thing that fiction allows me to do is to look into the interiority of characters. I think sometimes when you are doing journalism, you're interviewing someone, there's only so much you can actually enter that person's mind. And of course, what's being revealed to you is also very intersubjective, right? Your presence influences what that person is willing to open up and share with you. Whereas I feel that with fiction, I kind of like totally leapfrog over that process of that kind of intersubjective interaction and try to get under the person's skin, try to get inside the person's mind, and portray a certain kind of subjectivity that I think is no less important than journalistic objectivity. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, my answer is going to be shorter because I think it was clear that Saga was very much about sort of, news, current affairs, right? Things that had happened in the very recent past. I mean, I also think that obviously all art is political, right? Like whether like implicitly or explicitly, right? But yeah, I mean, I will say that while we were making Saga, so 2019 and 2020, we were obviously paying attention to what was going on. Like we always, aware always does, paying attention to what's happening politically, in particular concerning these issues. But the sort of three things that I remember kind of thinking a lot about and having conversations with people about was Watin. The sort of the Watin scandal, I guess, scandal, when they were not allowed to play, right, to perform in Singapore. And then of course POFMA, and of course the updates to the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act. I was paying a lot of attention to that particularly because I thought that might have some bearing on what we were publishing, yeah.
I've got a lot of thoughts in this one, but for my story specifically, I already mentioned that that specific story on the 1 in 10 was the result of what was one of the most significant news items that year in 2013, the population white paper. But see, my entire book is about being in an in-between place. It's like being stuck in a liminal state, and it actually, if you are a member of the diaspora or you're not a majority, one of the majority things, those are the news articles that actually stick to your mind, the ones that make you feel like you are in between places. And that has really, really affected the stories that I wrote here. It doesn't matter if it's a realist story or a speculative fiction story, but it's my lived experience. So it's very hard for me not to put that in my book. The thing is though, what G did not mention is I'm also a technical writer, so I write tech stories. And what happened was the reverse is also true. I find that instead of talking to you by giving you a meaningless statistic, globally 7 in 8 marriages actually are, not anymore, but previously ended up in divorce. Or I could give you gossip that, hey, my best friend's wife is cheating on him and they're having a divorce. Which one will you remember? So you can use stories actually to reinforce the statistics that are there. And I guess one of the things that fiction writers can bring to especially when we're working with nonfiction writers, is we can actually help create the stories that make people remember. A dry statistic gives you the truth of it. It tells you the extent of something, how and basically lays out the scientific reality of something. But the story is what they remember, and that's why there's room for both.
Yeah. Right. I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to open up to the floor. Oh, you have a question? Yeah, please. You can shout from there. Yeah, we can all hear you, bro.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Kelly, Alfian, and Victor for your talk. It was very good, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. So my question is probably an extension of the question you just asked, and it's about, I suppose, the tension of being an activist or someone who has a point to say, and a creative writer, and or how to say it in a way that is not, you're not like talking to kids, right? Like you still have your creative freedom in it, and you're still trying to be able to make a point. So for example, like Kelly, you mentioned in your podcast, right? Like every point you're trying to debunk after, not everybody, like there's this kind of humor in it, and it's quite true. Like there's a humor in it 3 or 4 times, but I suppose like if you do it every single time, it's kind of, to the audience might be okay, I get it now. Like it's a bit like repetitive or like, so. I suppose then how do you deal with this tension of still making a point that people understand in the sense that it's activism, that is very clear, but also being your own creative a bit of treating your audience like they can get it. And I think you'll do it quite well, so I think I would love to know what's your brain process about.
No, that's an excellent question. Actually, I have a question that's very similar to that as well. So thank you for asking that question. It is the tension, isn't it, between having a message and then one's commitment to the story, which might be quite a different thing. There seems to be in tension. How do you manage that tension between the two?
Anyone? Want to go backwards this time?
Let me go. Actually, if you are a writer, you are essentially a communicator. And if it is important for you to let your message be heard, after you dealt with your own anger at a particular issue, you need to remember that you need to make people understand your point of view and understand the message. And if they are not listening, you will not be able to get that through. That's why it takes not just skill, but the ability to empathize with your enemy, to be able to tell them your point of view in a way that they will understand. And for me, that is critical.
Yeah, I'm struggling to answer the question because I think that, yeah, I mean, that was very much like, well, I guess, in this case, there's not that much, I don't know that necessarily there was that much tension between like telling a good story and sort of like getting the quote unquote message across, because I think the story and the message were like the same, right? Like let's look at this thing that happened, right? I mean, whether like I as a writer, right, or aware as the organization that produced it, like has some kind of hidden agenda. I mean, I think we don't, right? It was I think we made sure to be quite clear from the start, like our agenda is to revisit this thing that happened and sort of like interview as many people who are involved as possible to get the broader sort of like plurality, right, of voices. And yeah, I mean, of course, like sort of in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, you know, I did think personally, like this is hopefully a little small contribution that like I can make to like sort of the, you know, at the time the repeal movement, right, or like I just in general, like the LGBT rights movement in this country, but not in any sort of top line way, right? I mean, I think I think it, you know, I guess I did think that there was some value in sort of like really taking a very hard look at what I view as the hypocrisy behind some of the, like, you know, the actions that led to the saga, and not just the actions but the rhetoric, right, the ideas, the ideology, but like, and I think maybe naively at the time I thought if you expose the hypocrisy, then, you know, like that like it convinces other people, but I don't think so anymore. I don't think that people's sort of inclinations politically or whatever like actually work in that sort of logical way, right? I think that was a bit naive on my part. But yeah, I mean, I hope that we made I do hope that this contributed a little bit and has contributed a bit to that conversation in Singapore, but that's, I think, sort of beside the point, right? I think the sort of primary goal was to what I said, to really just dive really deep into this incredible story that, to my knowledge, had not been really ever told in the way that it deserved. That it was like, for me, crying out to be told. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know whether this is helpful, but so I've often got this message, got these questions about how do you avoid being didactic, right? How do you avoid kind of like lecturing or soapboxing or grandstanding when you're writing your works, especially political works. And I think for me it's been useful to kind of make a distinction between a message and a point of view. So a message for me is something that's often very, there's very certain of itself, there's a certain certainty involved. And then,
emphasis.
and it often is very untroubled by complexities. For example, it can often manifest in a slogan which is quite clear cut, you know. But I think a point of view can be a lot more complex, and it can sit with ambiguity. It can be quite comfortable with contradictions. And actually, the political works that I really admire are the ones that, you know, are not just agitprop, but actually can embrace multiple points of views, and can be this very messy and ambiguous thing at the end of the day, and has that kind of like openness to interpretation. You know, it's something that I think values the sophistication of the audience. Yeah, and I think the thing about message though is it's a very top-down kind of thing. It assumes that your audience is somehow just needs to be lectured to, whereas I think a point of view acknowledges that the audience will also have their point of view. Yeah, so I think that has been helpful for me.
Thank you. Another question?
Okay, so this is more for Kelly, but the rest you can, I think, jump in, I guess. How do you interrogate the past, especially when our memory and narrative of the past changes on the context that we live in? Like, what if, say, you know, there'll be Nubat succeeded, tried, but like, you know, our memory of this thing is different, right? So, how do you interrogate that distinction? There are points in time where things will change, and you know,
So yeah, I mean, I think great question. Like there was, like saga is a kind of oral history, right? And I think like, so like inherent in that, like endeavor, there is space, right, for these like sort of slippages, right, in people's memory, like, and it's true, like we would interview people and they'd be like, yeah, I'm very sure it's like this, and then someone else would be like, no, it wasn't like that at all, and so like, you know what I mean, who is right, right? So obviously we did anchor a lot of it in, like, luckily the good thing about Saga is that it was so intensely covered, right, by the media, like both independent and mainstream media at the time, right? Obviously the scene was very different in 2009, but there was so much like literature about the saga that I think we had a very, very strong sort of like foundation to base, you know, what we believe is more or less factually accurate. And then from there, you know, then go and ask the people who are actually on the ground and be like, is this what, you know, does this match your recollection of it? Does that answer the question?
A little bit.
Yeah.
But like, you know, our memories are like, they change, right? So like, you know, what is the inherent truth in terms of, how do you get to the inherent truth when it comes to,
Can I?
like, is there a truth?
Okay, actually, life, like history, is a flow, not a point in time thing. You're right. At a point in time, we could suddenly live in a Margaret Atwood Handmaid's Tale thing, where everything becomes ultra-conservative, or the flip opposite can happen. You can live in a utopian society like Star Trek, and suddenly all of that doesn't matter. The point is, it changes from point to time in a sliding scale. What is important is what Kelly mentioned, actually, that there is a literature that survives and that is kept precisely because things change. If you keep these things there, if there's still stuff, if Kelly's podcasts are still around 1,000 years from now, and it doesn't matter which end of the pendulum it swings, because we need to trust people enough that they can read through these things and make up their own minds on what is correct. And that's my 2 cents worth for this.
Yeah, and like, so we interviewed like 50 people, right, for the podcast. So like, I do think that there can be some consensus drawn out of like the 50, right? If like most of them agree that this is like how it went, right? Which actually, so on that first question as well, right? I have a more of an answer now. Which is that, oh God, what was the first question? I'm blanking now. Yeah, right. Which was that, you know, like I guess one way that we also, and this is like illuminated by what Alfian said, right? That one way that we knew that it wouldn't be didactic, this project, was because most of the sort of like principal characters that we were interviewing, like, are these extremely sort of like self-reflective, like articulate, people who were extremely vulnerable and like willing to open themselves up and be really honest, and we got that sense, right? It was very clear, like just in talking to, just having like brief conversations with them at the onset of the project, like, oh, these are people who are willing to like dig deep into the trauma that they went through, because it was a very traumatic event for many of them. And I think for various reasons, there were people who were like, I do not want to be involved in this because it just opens up, like, just emotionally I can't. But the people who did want to be involved, like they were really willing to sort of like reflect and account for their own mistakes, right? The disagreements that they had, there was squabbles, there was infighting, there are sort of like wounds that have yet to be healed, I think, between even like the parties on one side, right? So I think just kind of having that richness, that sort of diversity was like, oh, okay, like, so it's not a single message, sort of,
Yeah, what you say is so important, isn't it? Because, you know, at a very abstract, you know, highly abstract level, one might think of the podcast as one story versus another story, right? And if all are stories, and whose version should we trust? But what you've said is so important, because when you come down to person, right, you think about the question of trustworthiness, right? Who you trust? We will more likely trust people who are very, very self-reflective and self-aware, who is willing to dig deep, who is willing to speak and be vulnerable, rather than the group with the opposite, you know, characteristics, right? I mean, that's why one story will not just be credible, you know, but will perhaps be closer to the truth, if one may say so. We may never arrive at the final truth, but we can trust that it's closer than the other story. Yeah, thank you. We have time for one last question. Who would like to ask the last question of the day? Because I really want to give you time to rush up to the fair and get your books and come back down and get our authors to sign for you before they run off. So, oh, they all want to rush to the fair now.
I just have one thing to add.
Okay, go on, please.
So I've got kids, and I keep telling my kids at the end of the day, the only thing you will remember of your dad is your stories. So whichever side of the fence you go to, you need to keep telling your stories because that's the only way you're going to survive.
Alright, thank you. For that beautiful, eloquent last statement, Victor. And please put your hands together again for all three of our panelists, Kelly,